So not everybody was happy about the Industrial Revolution and the free market capitalism that spread prodigiously throughout this period, so I reckon we ought to look at some of the reactions that it inspired. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, now in all our talk about the Industrial Revolution over the last few videos, I haven't really mentioned the effects it had on the working class. Factory work was, to use the technical term, dull as heck, but at least they got to do it for 13 hours a day and get paid just enough to keep them real poor. And so the working classes in this situation began to call for reform, and that came in a variety of flavors. First, there were calls for political reform. And a big reason for this is that many Western nations have been recognizing the right to vote for more and more people in their population. And that sounds great, right? Well, yeah, unless you look at it from the perspective of long-standing political parties who had previously only been concerned to appeal to the interest of the upper classes who were the only ones eligible to vote. So now with more of the working class eligible to vote, we can see the rise of mass-based political parties that aim to represent the interests of workers. For example, conservatives and liberals both in Britain and in France had to incorporate social reforms into their platforms because more and more people who wanted those reforms were voting. And second, there were calls for social reform. So as I said before, life for the industrial working class was hard. And so one response to the calls for social reform was that working class people began to organize themselves into social societies that provided insurance for sickness and social events in an otherwise bleak existence. And then third, there were calls for educational reform. Now this will only make sense if you understand that between 1870 and 1914, the majority of European governments passed compulsory education laws to get boys and girls between the ages of 6 and 12 into school. And if you too love being in school 5 days a week for most of your young life, then thank the Industrial Revolution. Additionally, in the midst of the Second Industrial Revolution, high-paying jobs were becoming more and more technical and specialized, and therefore compulsory education prepared children for those kinds of jobs. And then fourth, there were calls for urban reform. So due to the intense crowding of industrial cities whose infrastructure was not able to keep up with the growth, urban areas were dangerous and, to put it mildly, stanky. Like without much proper sanitation infrastructure, people just took the buckets in which they had so unceremoniously deposited their nasties and tossed it out the window. And so one response to this situation was that various governments passed laws and invested in sanitation infrastructure like sewers, which were great because those dumped your nasties down into the river. That's going to cause its own problems, but we'll get to that in the next video. Okay, now another significant manifestation of reform among the working class was the creation and rise of labor unions. Essentially, a labor union is a collective of workers who join together in order to protect their own interests. You see, prior to these reforms, labor unions were illegal in many places, and so all the power for change was in the hands of wealthy capitalists and factory owners, and they weren't too flexible. Hey boss, I just lost another finger. Can I get a couple hours off to go to the doctor? Well, those machines ain't gonna run themselves, and you still got 3 good fingers, so get back to work. So before this, no one worker could affect change in the system. But labor unions were collectives of hundreds or thousands of workers, and that gave them a lot more power to negotiate and bargain with employers to improve their lives. And as unions multiplied throughout Europe and then into the United States and then to a more limited degree in Asia and Africa, they used their collective power to bargain for higher wages and limited working hours and improved working conditions. And by the end of the 19th century, British labor unions could count nearly 2 million workers on their rolls, while German and American unions had about 1 million each. And some of these unions turned into proper political parties that sought to enact reforms on behalf of the working classes in the highest levels of government. For example, the German Social Democratic Party was formed out of the General German Workers Association, and it advocated for Marxist reform in Germany. Specifically, they aimed to transform the capitalist system of private ownership of the means of production to social ownership of the means of production. And that leads nicely to our next point. So not all the people reacting to industrialization and capitalism responded with physical acts like strikes or whatever. Now, there were also some folks that got real thinky about it, and the chief actor here is our boy Karl Marx. Now, he was a German, but he lived in Great Britain for a long time, and he witnessed firsthand the suffering and injustices the working class endured on account of a society entirely awash in filthy capitalism. And Marx believed that capitalism was by nature an unstable system that couldn't hack it in the long run, especially because it created a sharp class division in industrial societies. Like here were the fancy pants upper class folks sipping their drinks and filling their leisure time with cockfights and other weirdness, and the only reason they were able to do that is because the working class suffered to keep them wealthy. Therefore, by Marx's reckoning, that situation couldn't go on forever, and the inevitable result would be a violent revolution of the lower classes against the upper classes, and the result would be a classless society. And so, Marx and Friedrich Engels published these ideas in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and they called their approach scientific socialism. And Marx's argument was essentially historical. He argued that history obeys laws just as the physical world obeys the laws of physics. Therefore, history moved through patterns and stages with its major energy arising out of class struggle until one day it would reach its ultimate goal. Essentially, what he's arguing is that the intense societal changes brought on by the Industrial Revolution had violently exacerbated the division between the two groups of Marx's classification, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie were those who owned the means of production, like factories and lands, and thus exploited the proletariat for their own benefit. And so, once the proletariat became conscious of that arrangement, they would rise up in a cataclysmic moment of revolution revolution and overthrow the bourgeoisie, and that would mark the end of class struggle, and there would be no more classes, and everyone would just exist in a warm socialistic hug. Okay, now let's turn the corner and consider two state-level responses to industrialization, and we'll start with our friends over in Qing, China. So in the late 18th century, China continually snubbed British traders. Big mistake! And the result was a trade deficit that Britain sought to remedy. And how would they remedy that? By creating more desirable goods that would attract Chinese buyers? Don't be crazy. They started importing illegal opium, which was a highly addictive drug from British-controlled India. And as the drug began to have serious negative consequences on the Chinese population, Qing authorities cracked down on the illegal trade, which led to two conflicts known as the Opium Wars. And long story short, Britain was an industrial power and China was not. And so British industrial might easily defeated the less modernized Chinese forces and forced them to sign unequal treaties that opened several trading ports against their will. And that defeat was like blood in the water, and all the industrialized sharks in the world smelled it and were like, that smells good. And so by the end of the century, more industrialized nations took advantage of China's weakness and carved it up into various spheres of influence in which they had exclusive trading rights. Now look, this is China we're talking about, like arguably the most powerful and influential state in most of world history. They're not going to take all this laying down. And so throughout the 1860s and 70s, Chinese authorities responded to this invasion of Western powers with the self-strengthening movement. It was a series of reforms that sought to take some steps toward industrialization while also revitalizing traditional Chinese culture. And though some steps were made in modernizing China, the full benefits of industrialization were hindered by Chinese conservatives who resisted these developments because the reforms threatened the power of the landowning class. And so the result was kind of a half-hearted program of modernization. And that program was put to the test in the Sino-Japanese War, and with a crushing defeat at the hands of the industrial Japanese, China's self-strengthening movement was deemed a failure. And that's sad, but now let's consider another state-level response to industrialization in the Ottoman Empire. So by the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become known among Western powers as the sick man of Europe, owing to its continued territorial loss to industrial countries and its inability to raise sufficient tax revenue. Just like China, the Ottomans had become unwillingly subservient to powerful industrial nations because they had not yet industrialized. Therefore, just like China, Ottoman authorities decided that a kind of defensive industrialization was necessary. And that process was the result of the Tanzimat reforms, and it was far more aggressive and transformative than China's limp self-strengthening movement. So during this time, the Ottomans built textile factories, implemented Western-style law codes and courts, and expansive education systems for children, all of which were more secular in nature and thus significantly divorced from the historic Islamic character of the empire. And as a result of these reforms, a new group seeking widespread political change emerged known as the Young Ottomans. They desired the establishment of a European-style parliament and a constitutional government that would limit the power of absolutist sultans who sought to run everybody's crap in total. And so it might surprise you to hear that in 1876, the sultan conceded and accepted a constitution and a parliament. Wow, that's great. Way to embrace democratic ideals, my dear sultan. But when a potential war with Russia was starting to brew, the sultan leaned right into his conservatism and rejected any curtailment of his power, and that lasted for something like 3 decades. Even so, the Ottoman reforms and industrialization projects would be more effective than China's, but not so effective that it wouldn't stop the empire from falling apart at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 5, and click here to grab my AP World Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.